161. Make friends. Celine woke in a dim room, pain and weakness flaring through her body. She couldn't even move a finger. Nothing like this had happened since she became a vampire. Even being shot, hit by a car, or exposed to sunlight had never produced this kind of paralysis. After a moment, she forced her mind to steady itself, dispelling the worst of the nausea and confusion, and then clearly heard a voice beside her. "Bruce, if you keep staring at me like that, you can forget about keeping those dog teeth of yours." Chris had found a porcelain bowl and filled it with a dragon blood tonic, intending to give it to his prized wolf dog. The animal, however, greeted the kindness by baring its fangs, so Chris had to threaten it a couple of times. Lucien ignored the insult. He'd endured humiliations worse than this when he had been a slave to vampires. From long experience, he understood one thing. When you are weak, whatever the strong do is right. Still, Lucien had questions. He couldn't understand where this strange, powerful human had come from. "Who are you?" he growled. "Why are you interfering in the war between us and the vampires?" Chris burst out laughing when he heard the word war. War? That's funny. If Chris remembered correctly, total human deaths from werewolf-vampire conflicts over thousands of years numbered less than a few 100,000. Hardly a war. Lucien's choice of words was laughable to him. The dragon blood tonic made Lucien's throat move on instinct. He couldn't think past the urge. He bent, snatched the porcelain bowl, and drank greedily. The tonic, rich in concentrated energy, slid down his throat and filled him with an unprecedented sense of satisfaction. Strength surged through him, his depleted body recovering in an instant and growing even stronger. Chris watched as Lucien's aura swelled, an expression of "as expected" on his face. He had guessed right. Werewolves and vampires in this world were extraordinary beings. How could they not be? The problem was energy. Like Chris in his own past, these beings suffered from a chronic shortage of the energy substances they needed to sustain their powers. That deficiency forced them to prey on humans. Humans, as an intelligent anti-entropic species, constantly absorb energy and information from the environment and end up hoarding amounts they cannot fully use. For powerful supernatural creatures, that surplus becomes food. Even the ogre who'd given Chris his first windfall had been like that. That particular ogre, cursed in some way, could only move for 23 days every 23 years, so it couldn't maintain its peaks and had become Chris's first startup capital. Werewolves and vampires were luckier. Originating from humans, they retained mobility, and by feeding on humans, preserved the core of their extraordinary natures instead of sliding out of the realm of the supernatural entirely. After being fed, the Wolf King's long-starved reserves were replenished. His power increased 3 to 5 times. Lucien began to shift into wolf form, body swelling until it seemed he would tear the narrow room apart. Chris raised an arm and slapped the giant wolf across the face. "Change back to human form, you hear me." The slap and the command landed together. Lucien, drunk on the rush of power, snapped back to awareness, eyes huge and furious, but the sting on his face forced him out of his beast form. "Wrap yourself in that blanket. There's a lady here." Lucien hesitated as he reverted, then reached out with a clawed hand, grabbed the blanket from the floor, and hung it over himself. "Good boy," Chris said, and petted the wolf's head, still not fully human, smiling because it felt better than Brian's had. When Lucien had fully returned to human shape, Chris withdrew his hand and stepped toward the pale woman on the bed. "My apologies. I didn't expect you to be so frail. I actually held back, and I still nearly killed you." His apology had little sincerity, but he studied the cold beauty before him with interest. Her aloof air, stunning looks, and flawless face struck a chord in him. If there was one thing that tugged Chris's heartstrings, it was a confident, mature woman. The only trivial flaw in his assessment was her small chest, an A-cup, which for some reason stuck in the back of his mind as an imperfection in an otherwise perfect package. Fortunately, she was a vampire who had lived almost 1,000 years. Her maturity more than made up for it. Celine watched this peculiar human calmly, perhaps stunned. Any vampire would be at least a little dumbfounded to see someone capable of slapping a werewolf out of its form and returning it to consciousness, especially after witnessing the dramatic jump in Lucien's strength after that mysterious potion. Lucien stood by, uneasy, noticing how differently Chris treated Celine. He ventured, "Sir, would you like me to leave you some privacy?" Chris looked surprised, then smiled. "That's sensible of you." Lucien smiled, lowered his head, and stepped back to demonstrate obedience. Just as he reached the door, Chris called after him, "You stand outside and watch. If I can't sense your aura, you'll be responsible for the consequences." The joy on Lucien's face died. His smile froze. A moment later, he recovered and answered without a hitch, "My honor, sir." Satisfied, Chris let him withdraw. He came closer to Celine with a smug air. "Your father trained him well. Want to hear the story between him and your father?" Celine's startled eyes flickered, and she looked at Chris with a new curiosity. That would start with the birth of an immortal. 162. She killed her father with a girl. Impossible. You're slandering my father. Celine's eyes blazed as she lashed out at Chris. If she hadn't been so aware of the difference in their power, her Deathwalker's hand would probably already have been around his throat. But she held back. Chris didn't seem offended by her outrage. He whistled once and called Lucien over. "My lord, what can I do for you?" Lucien bowed to Chris with visible respect. In both word and gesture, the Wolf King treated Chris like a superior. "I heard the story you told. Tell me, how much of it is true?" Chris leaned back against Celine's knee, breathing in the faint, distinctive scent of a vampire, and said casually, "Tell me what you know." Lucien considered for a moment, then answered cautiously, "I don't know every detail he mentioned, but most of it matches what I've heard. From what I know of Victor, he's not sentimental. He would execute even his own blood if he thought it necessary. He doesn't strike me as the sort to simply adopt a human girl." "You heard him too," Chris observed, glancing up and meeting Celine's smooth jawline with an expression that held a touch of regret. Celine ignored the implication. The corroboration from Lucien, combined with Chris's menace, tugged at doubts she had long buried about Victor's behavior. Seeing her falter, Chris sat up, considered, and said, "Hearing isn't the same as seeing, and you probably won't believe me just because Lucien said so. Let's go ask your adoptive father yourself." He stood and helped Celine up. "Besides," he added, "vampires can read memories by drinking blood. When the time comes, you drink some of Victor's blood, and you'll know everything." Celine's eyes sharpened. Decision replaced denial. She stepped out without hesitation, and Chris followed. Lucien, who had already expected this, fell in beside them, excited, despite himself. For centuries, he had led the werewolves against the vampires, all for the chance to cut off Victor's head. He had longed for this day of vengeance. If Victor died by someone else's hand, he didn't care. He only wanted Victor gone. They soon arrived at the vampire stronghold. The windows were shuttered, the doors sealed tight so that not a sliver of sunlight escaped. Lucien bared his fangs at the sight, anger showing in the set of his shoulders. If not for the sturdiness of modern construction, he would have led a charge long ago. Chris watched Celine, then produced a small bottle. "Try this," he said, offering it. Celine examined the label. Some kind of tonic, dragon blood beverage, it said. She remembered how different Lucien had seemed after drinking similar stuff and swallowed the contents without hesitation. As she drank, a stray shaft of sunlight struck her face. The exposed skin blistered and flaked away into ash, yet no heat radiated from it. For a moment, Chris only stared. Matter reducing to dust without the expected release of heat made no sense. He entertained, for an instant, the cruel thought of exposing more of her to the sun to see what would happen, then dismissed it. She was a woman he had an interest in. Cruelty was unnecessary. The ash vanished, and her skin healed as if nothing had happened. Celine felt a strange fullness, an energy she had never known, surging through her. She realized with a jolt that her strength had increased, and that for a short time she could tolerate sunlight in a way she never had before. Curiosity overcame caution. She took off one leather glove and held her hand up into the sun. Sizzle. Her hand blackened and smoked like meat on a grill, a revolting smell filling the air. She snapped the glove back on in alarm. Within moments, the smell faded and her hand was whole again. In the past, even brief sun exposure would have reduced her hand to dust for good. Now it recovered. She was certain she could withstand the sun for a short period without dying. Chris passed her a second bottle. "Drink this too," he said. "Replenish it." Celine hesitated only a second. The tonic looked ordinary, but she could feel there was more to gain. She drank it, then inclined her head to Chris in thanks. I owe you. If you ever need anything, ask. Chris smiled. No rush. We'll talk after you find out the truth. Lucien took a bottle as well, but tucked it away. What he'd already consumed had him at a peak state, and the extra bottle could save him later if things went badly. Celine led them to the main gate and entered the password. The great doors clicked open. The human guards stationed there saw her and did not interfere. They had chosen to serve the vampires, some out of fear, some out of greed. But they all knew Celine was not to be provoked. She was Victor's favored daughter, one of the 3 elder family's kin, and the strongest warrior of the younger vampire generation. Now this warrior was bringing strangers into the heart of her house, one of them Lucien, the vampire's sworn enemy, and it was daylight when vampires were at their weakest. They walked down a dark corridor and pushed open a low-key yet luxurious heavy wooden door into the main hall of the vampire fortress. The huge room was full of vampires, men and women, laughing, drinking, and entertaining themselves. When the door opened, a few heads turned, then relaxed when they recognized Celine, the death dealer. Most went back to their business, but several combat vampires who knew her came forward, faces grave. Celine, where have you been? Why have you only just returned? One demanded. Do you know that if Craven hadn't kept things in check, the council elders would have issued a warrant for your arrest? Another added. A cold, beautiful female vampire on the side glanced at the 2 men with Celine and frowned. Who are they? Weren't you supposed to be hunting Lucien? She asked in confusion. Lucien, hooded, flashed a mocking grin when he heard his name. Chris offered a small smile to the young vampire woman. Young only in appearance, perhaps, while Celine said nothing. Her voice came low and urgent. Where is Elder Victor? I have urgent matters to report. The gathered vampires exchanged looks. Celine's tone was unusual, but everyone knew how loyal she was to the clan and that she'd long been Victor's favored daughter. Despite their confusion, they told her, Elder Victor is in the council hall, discussing things with Craven. Are you sure you want to go there now? As soon as she knew Victor's location, Celine strode for the council hall. Those still enjoying themselves fell silent and moved aside to make way. Chris followed, eyes roaming with evident appreciation for the spectacle. If only, he thought with a small regret, vampires tended not to be as well proportioned as he preferred. Lucien followed behind, looking as coldly appraising as ever. His eyes held nothing but predatory intent. He hadn't been given an order, though, so he dared not act. Instead, he catalogued scents and faces, making mental notes so none would escape him later. They reached the doorway to the council hall and paused. From within, a furious voice thundered, Bastards! How dare you break the clan rules and wake me early? Do you know what consequences this will bring? On a stone throne at the center, Victor sat wrapped in needles that drew blood and pulled at his old aching flesh, rousing him. Craven stood below him, visibly shaken. He hadn't expected Celine to be so bold. By waking Victor before the elders, she had wrecked Craven's scheme, cutting off his path to the power he'd wanted. He scrambled for an explanation. It was your daughter, Celine, he blurted. She secretly awakened you and led a team to the lichen den, saying she came to hunt Lucien. Lucien? Victor's face clouded with surprise and confusion. His mind was groggy from sleep. Which Lucien? Is it? Before he could finish, an answer came tearing through the doors. Of course I'm not dead! Lucien, who had been listening outside, exploded forward, kicking the doors down. He transformed in mid-stride into a towering lichen and lunged at Victor. For a moment, Craven and Victor were stunned. A lichen in the vampire stronghold? Had their warriors all been slaughtered? Victor's old instincts kicked in faster than his fogged thoughts. He twisted his withered body and toppled off the stone throne just as Lucien's massive lichen head crashed into it, shattering the thick seat into fragments. Idiot! Go get help! Victor roared at Craven, shoving him toward the exit to fetch reinforcements. But Craven, knocked backward by the force of the blow, slammed into Victor and sent the elder to the floor with a heavy thud. Chris walked through the gap Lucien had made and said calmly, Until what I've said is proven, I suggest you two stay where you are. He shot Lucien a sidelong look. The lichen had never been able to hold his temper. A few sharp words and he charged in like a bull. Chris found it exasperating. If you can't control yourself, go outside and take care of those others. Don't make a scene in front of me. Lucian's huge, bestial head hesitated. He wanted nothing more than to tear Victor apart on the spot, to pay him back without caring for anything else. But he also understood the gap between him and Chris. Chris's speed was beyond him. He couldn't hope to land a killing blow in front of someone who could move that fast. Resigned, Lucian let out a low, furious growl. The gust from it shoved Victor a little farther across the floor. Then the lichen turned and stalked out, deciding to first pick off weaker vampires to sate himself. Victor, back on his feet and furious, sneered, "I always knew you'd grown strong, so you've found yourself a fine master." Lucian spun to bare his fangs and rumble a threat, but Victor, sure his moment was near, went on taunting. "What? Your master hasn't even spoken, and you already want to overstep your bounds." Chris waved Lucian away with one hand and addressed Victor with a cool smile. "As expected of an old noble, you have a way with words." If Chris hadn't spent so much time with Jiaozi, Dumpling, who loved to quibble over phrases, he probably wouldn't have understood this archaic kind of speech. Victor snorted. "And who do you think you are, sir? I've lived for centuries, and I have never heard of you." 164. Download the Bloodline Ability Pack. Chris did not answer Victor. He simply stepped aside, revealing Celine, who had been hidden behind him. "You?" Victor's pupils shrank. For the first time, Chris had ever seen such a range of emotion cross the old man's dried features. Shock, anger, grief, until they dissolved into a hollow, bewildered stare. "You know everything?" Celine moved forward slowly, her gaze fixed on the most important being in her life. "At first, I suspected. Now I know." Victor flinched, unable to understand how she could speak with such certainty. He opened his mouth to speak, but Celine had already seized his wrist. With a hiss, her fangs sank into his skin. Blood flooded into her mouth, and with it, a torrent of memories. Marcus's dealings with Victor, Victor's battles hunting the lichen progenitor William, the grief of discovering his daughter living with the lichen Lucian, and, in a frenzy, executing her. Then later taking in Celine after slaughtering her family because he had felt in her the same emotions he'd seen in his daughter. As Celine read, Victor, who had looked like a freshly unearthed mummy even before, grew gaunter. His chest still rose and fell, but the life in him was ebbing away. From the corner of the chamber, Lucian returned to human form, still smeared with blood. His emotions had settled. He was no longer torn about Victor's fate, partly because Victor's breaths were now fewer than his exhales, and death was close. Lucian paid Victor little heed. He turned to Craven, who lay motionless and feigning death, and asked in a low voice, "What should we do with him? Kill him?" Craven could no longer keep up the act. He leapt to his feet, prostrated himself, and begged for mercy. "Please spare me. I'm useful. I can help gather the remaining vampires." He angled his pleas higher, hoping to sweeten them. "There's a vampire progenitor, Marcus, asleep nearby. I can wake him. I can lure another vampire elder here." Chris frowned at the wheedling. The man irritated him. At Chris's curt order, Lucian, who moved with a sudden lethal precision, darted forward and snapped Craven's head from his shoulders. Having drunk the dragon blood potion, Lucian's speed and strength had multiplied. He could now dispatch foes far faster than elite vampires, which explained how he had slaughtered hundreds in such a short span. The more Lucian fought, the more he realized Chris's power dwarfed his own. The display in the sewers was nothing next to it. Chris stepped forward and helped Celine to her feet, drawing her into his arms and murmuring softly, "The dead can't be brought back. If you have no family left in this world, you can consider me your family." Celine, shattered, heard only warmth in his words. Lucian, watching, forced a smile and prudently moved away so as not to provoke Chris. Celine, however, overwhelmed by grief and the sudden tenderness, poured the years of her love into him like a storm. Chris, young and earnest, found himself unable to resist. He yielded to her, and by the time night had fallen, the storm had passed. Victor had finally breathed his last. When Lucian returned, dragging another mummified body, he paused. He'd smelled the strong scent of life in the air and noted the color that had returned to Celine's cheeks, a human-looking flush he had never seen on vampire elders like Victor or Marcus, who had always appeared pale. Lucian realized that vampires could, with sufficient life force, regain a human appearance. Normal vampires lacked the means. Encountering a divine being like Chris had been their only chance. Chris had not only given them strange potions, but had constantly helped replenish Celine's life force, restoring her to a level no vampire among them had seen before. Lucian looked at Chris with a mixture of bafflement and awe. Chris, however, showed no signs of exertion, no flushed face, no labored breath, the same as before Lucian had gone wandering. "What are you staring at? What did you bring back?" Chris asked, irritated by the pause. Lucian respectfully set the corpse down. "This is what I found while wandering. He's the vampire progenitor, Marcus." Marcus looked even more emaciated than Victor. Chris scratched his jaw and asked Celine, "What do you want me to do? Kill him or imprison him?" It was Celine's kin from the progenitor line. Out of respect, he sought her opinion. She looked at Marcus's faint breath and answered without hesitation, "He's your captive. You decide." She had reached resolution. Vampires and lichens were monsters. She had no relatives among them to cling to. Chris was about to order Lucian to deal with Marcus when, on impulse, he reached out and crushed the older vampire's skull. A white surge of life essence shot into Chris, and with it a flood of new, minor magical abilities. His intuition had been right. The vampire progenitor was a treasure. 165. Body Optimization. In the Underworld films, Marcus, the vampire progenitor, displayed a variety of powers: flight, drinking blood to read memories, restoring his body by consuming animal flesh and blood, and transforming into a bat-like creature. Setting aside the painfully useless and ugly bat transformation, even just the memory-reading ability alone would have been invaluable to Chris. What he didn't expect, after devouring Marcus's life essence, was that the gifts the progenitor passed on were far richer than he'd imagined. Beyond the abilities Marcus showed on film, Chris also gained telepathy and control over flesh and blood. Because Chris's own life essence far exceeded Marcus's, those abilities manifested through him with even greater power. Rejecting the bat transformation ability outright, Chris explored the changes Marcus's powers brought him. The flesh and blood manipulation alone would push his strength to another level, or perhaps, more accurately, would finally let him unleash more of the strength he already had. Without some way to alter the human body's internal structure, raw power and speed are limited by physiology. No matter how much brute force he could produce, Chris's human-like form and lack of constant supernatural energy kept him from realizing his full potential. He was still bound by the laws of physics. Now, with the new ability to manipulate flesh and blood and the guidance of his enhanced mind, Chris could change that. Working within physical constraints, he carefully reconfigured his internal structure while keeping the body's basic form intact. His massive, bulging muscles began to contract. Internal muscle fibers were reworked and re-knit, the loose, irregular musculature merging into a more efficient, powerful architecture. His height shifted next. It first dropped sharply, the nearly 2-meter frame compressed down to about 1.5 meters, momentarily making him shorter than Celine standing beside him. Celine blinked, stunned. The towering figure she had just known now looked squat and oddly disproportionate. Had Marcus cursed him? Before she could finish the thought, Chris's body reassembled again. Bones split, grew, and reformed. He regained some of his height, his clothes stretching slightly, but overall he was a size smaller than before. The result was not a bulky behemoth, but a streamlined, compact fighter, lean, balanced, and efficient, radiating a quiet menace. "What is this?" Celine asked, trying to reconcile the change. "Nothing," Chris replied with a shrug, dismissing it. "Just a second growth spurt." Celine narrowed her eyes. His flippant tone made her feel as if he were treating her like a child. "He looks weaker, but somehow I find him more terrifying." Chris was about to tease her further when he suddenly turned his head toward Lucian. It wasn't a sound that had drawn him. He had read Lucian's brainwaves. Lucian, seeing Chris look at him, dropped to one knee and spoke with practiced deference. "Noble sir, do you have any commands?" His face was respectful, but his thoughts were panicked. "Is this thing going to kill me too? I should have slipped away earlier if I'd known." Chris stared at Lucian without speaking, and the vampire's legs trembled. He looked as if he might bolt. Just as Lucian was losing his composure, Chris chuckled and said, I don't have any commands for you, but you look like the leader of the lichens. Can you gather them? I need manpower. What do you wish to do, sir? Lucian asked warily. My former subordinates were scattered by the vampires. It will take time to reassemble them. Chris's laugh echoed, sharp and unexpected. It unnerved Lucian further. Celine, hearing Lucian's panic and Chris's amusement telepathically, stepped forward, concern on her face, and took his hand. Chris, sensing her worry, patted her arm to reassure her, then continued, Find 2 people for me. One is Alexander, the common progenitor of your lichens and the vampires. The other is Mike, the one you were hunting earlier. Alexander is still alive? Celine blurted, surprised. Chris shrugged. You vampires and lichens live forever. How could he, an original immortal, have died already? Lucian's expression shifted as he processed that. Marcus, who carried Alexander's bloodline, was alive, so Alexander's survival made sense. A strange suspicion crossed Lucian's face. This creature before him wasn't from Alexander's era, was he? Why else would such a powerful being simply appear now? Ignoring the mental noise around him, Chris pressed on. The reason the centuries-long war between vampires and lichens didn't spill over into human society was Alexander. He acted as a buffer. That's the lead you should follow. I'll investigate immediately, Lucian said, bowing. I'll report back with anything I find. Go, Chris said noncommittally. Lucian left the fortress. Chris led Celine into the palace hall. The sight inside was devastation. Bodies and severed limbs lay scattered among toppled columns, the floor pitted and scarred as if by violent blows. Sunlight poured through gashes in the walls and ceiling, striking the carnage and burning many of the surviving vampires to ash where it touched them. The air smelled of ozone and the metallic tang of spilled blood, and the silence that settled over the ruins felt suddenly fragile, as if the next sound might be the beginning of something even worse. 166. How to become a daywalker. Celine had never felt much affection for her own kind, and after learning the truth about her parents' deaths, she felt even more disgusted. Still, seeing so many of those she had lived with fall in such a brutal way tugged at something in her. She couldn't help but feel a measure of sorrow. Chris noticed her mood and moved to comfort her. He pulled the beautiful vampire into his arms and murmured, "You still have me." Melted by the warmth of his embrace, Celine returned it without hesitation. Her hand wandered restlessly. Chris's puzzled expression betrayed his surprise. Are vampires all that direct? He wondered. But he wasn't the sort to fuss. If Celine, a woman, had no qualms, then he certainly didn't. The two grew intimate almost instantly. Amid the mountain of corpses, the sea of blood, and the crumbled ruins around them, they made love again. She was a monstrous creature that fed on human essence and blood. He was a transcendent human, nourished by dragon blood. Neither was ordinary, so hygiene was the last thing on their minds. Chris rarely met a woman with such strength, and with emotions stirred, their embrace became a tumble across the hall. One moment in the center, the next rolled into a corner, until, without realizing it, they tumbled out into sunlight. A sizzling sound, like fat on a hot pan, filled the air. Celine cried out, fangs bared, and instinctively bit down. But Chris's skin was tougher than she expected. The bite didn't break the surface. He stroked her back, feeling her temperature spike and smelling the faint tang of roasted meat. He realized at once she had been burned. Worry pushed him to his feet. He carried Celine to the side and examined her carefully. Aside from a pained furrow in her brow, her injuries were surprisingly minor. In the time he checked her, the wounds had already begun to heal, proof that the life force he had poured into her these last few times had helped. It had let her tolerate the sun for a short while and limited the damage. Celine watched his slightly stunned face and, embarrassed, lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said. "That was my injured instinct. I didn't mean to." Chris lifted a finger to her lips and soothed. "It's okay. I don't mind. And you didn't even get through my skin." Celine snorted a laugh, the first time she'd ever heard someone call themselves thick-skinned. "I thought when you got stronger you'd be able to walk in the sun," she said. "Turns out you still can't." Chris felt a twinge of disappointment. He had seen Celine step into the sun and hoped, foolishly perhaps, that she might be immune, like in the films. It looked like her abundant life force had only temporarily blunted UV damage. She wasn't truly sunproof. Celine, on her part, laughed at his notion. "What a daydream," she said. "How could a vampire walk in the sun? I feel dozens of times stronger, but I still can't ignore daylight. Stop imagining things." Her skepticism was reasonable. If even the ancient vampire ancestor Marcus couldn't withstand sunlight, a third-generation vampire like Celine certainly wouldn't. Despite Chris's help making her far stronger, the sun was still a lethal threat. Otherwise, she wouldn't have reflexively tried to draw his blood a moment ago. Chris's brows twitched. He'd seen the movie where Celine drank Alexander's blood and became a daywalker, immune to sunlight, and could pass that gift on to others through her own blood. He hadn't found Alexander, and he had no intention of using that old man's blood to change Celine. She already carried that blood in her veins. What more did he need? Celine, seeing his skepticism, tried to steer the conversation away. "If you don't believe me, fine. I don't want to experiment on you. That would hurt," she said with a small edge of exasperation. Chris ignored the complaint and asked earnestly, "What if I could make you walk in the sun?" "Are you making a bet?" Celine raised an eyebrow, wrapping her arms around his neck and pressing herself against his chest. Chris felt his pulse quicken. "Yes, a bet," he said, serious. "If I can make you immune to sunlight, how will you repay me?" Celine was touched by how determined he sounded, though she held no real hope. Still, the idea of flirting through a wager amused her. She tilted her head, considered, then shrugged. "I don't know what you'd want. You choose." Chris's eyes lit up. "Good. It's settled." Celine smiled and nodded. She didn't expect to actually be able to walk in daylight, so the bet was mostly playful. She hadn't even asked what he'd demand if he failed. To her, his care was payment enough. Chris inwardly savored that she still had so little experience. She was foolishly trusting in the sweetest way. He had plans. Even without the movie's method of Alexander's blood, he could ask his younger brother, Jiaozi, Dumpling, to research a potion to turn vampires into daywalkers. If Jiaozi couldn't help, Chris had a remnant of divine tea, the tea left over from God itself, that contained enough power to transform a creature of darkness into one of light. Celine watched the gleam in his eyes, saw his lecherous grin as he imagined her dressing up as angels or demons to play games with him, and rolled her eyes. "What's your method? You're not going to make me drink some mysterious potion again, are you? That stuff didn't fix the root problem." She had experienced the effects of dragon blood potions before. They were like life force supplements, treating symptoms, not the cause. Chris flashed a roguish smile. "Hey, I won't back out. Just wait and see." Under Celine's slightly puzzled gaze, Chris raised two fingers together and decisively swiped them. Sk! His fingers sliced the air, and a pressure wave shot out like an invisible force, cracking the ground. He turned his head away, a little embarrassed. He had meant to nick his wrist with his nails so Celine could drink, but the little shockwave he'd sent out couldn't even break his skin. He hadn't expected that. Apparently, the muscle fibers he'd rewoven with his flesh manipulation were tougher than he'd thought. He slapped his forehead in annoyance. He'd just used flesh manipulation, and yet had been thinking the crude way, trying to cut himself with his fingernails. Foolish. Smiling to himself, he offered his wrist to the dazed Celine. This time, he used his ability intentionally. He peeled back the skin of his wrist and severed the blood vessels cleanly. "Try it," he said. "With my life level, if you can take even part of my genetic template, it'll be enough to make you a true daywalker." Celine stared at the exposed wrist. The blood around the vessels had drawn in like mercury, retracting slightly as if pulled by surface tension. Chris urged her, impatient, "Hurry up, or my blood vessels will heal right away." Chris's regeneration worked at the molecular level now. Unless something tore his molecular structure apart, it wouldn't count as real damage. He'd only cut a few cells. If he didn't suppress the healing, the wound would close in moments. Celine finally seemed to notice the healing. He could see the vessels knitting back together, and panic flickered across her face. Chris pushed his wrist forward until it was pressed against her lips. A vampire's instinct is fierce. Celine's resolve might have held if the blood hadn't been in her mouth, but with it, there she began to drink greedily. To To stop the vessels from rejoining, she instinctively extended her fangs and bit into the still open rupture, trying to keep it from sealing. Chris watched her drink, and instead of irritation, he felt a strange smile lift his features. He closed his eyes for a moment and let her feed. After a while, the sucking stopped. Chris opened his eyes. "Why'd you stop?" "Don't worry, I can spare you another half day of this," he said, assuming she was concerned for him. His body had long since moved beyond normal human limits. He had dragon blood potions to replenish himself and wasn't worried about anemia. Given Celine's size and appetite, he figured she couldn't drain him dry in any case. Celine flushed and looked embarrassed. Only then did Chris realize he had misread the situation. He crouched and peered at where Celine's mouth clamped his wrist. Celine, red-faced, parted her lips so he could see. His severed blood vessels had already healed. Only the skin he'd peeled back was exposed. The vessels had reconnected, and the outer membrane had reformed. Celine's fangs, which she'd used in an attempt to stop the repair, were now tangled in the newly formed tissue. She couldn't pull them free, and she couldn't drink. Chris felt equal parts amused and annoyed. He had mistaken her embarrassment for care. He pinched her nose and scolded, "Open wide, or I'll pull your fangs out." He wasn't truly going to rip them off. Celine's fangs were delicate, but he used the threat to compel cooperation. With a gentle press on each fang and a careful twist of his wrist, he freed them from the healed vessels. Chris examined the completely healed wrist and asked, "Little glutton, still want any?" Celine shook her head quickly. "No, I already feel myself changing." "Good," Chris said, raising an eyebrow. "Let's see how well it worked then." She nodded. Chris led her to the hole in the ceiling where sunlight streamed down. Without hesitation, Celine stepped into the light, arm extended. As he had predicted, after incorporating his genetic template and fixing her defects, she no longer recoiled from the sun. That made sense. If Alexander's genes could restore her in the original story, Chris's higher life level certainly could do the same. Celine stood fully in the sunlight, her pale skin catching the rays and shining like an otherworldly glow. She looked like an elf in the light. Chris stepped in close and wrapped his arms around her. "I won," he said softly. "When are you going to fulfill our wager?" Celine looked up at him with a teasing smile. "You haven't even told me what you want yet. How am I supposed to fulfill it?" Chris's eyes glinted. He leaned in, voice low by her ear, and whispered, "I want you to." 168, Chris's pressure mal. 3 days had already passed since Chris arrived in this world. Aside from a leisurely first day, the next 2 had been non-stop. Even with his unusually strong constitution, he felt oddly drained. He hadn't expected vampires to be so indulgent. Immortal by drinking blood, they had very few outlets for excess energy. They couldn't go out during the day and were confined to dark fortresses built for them. That was safe, but it left them cooped up. Those like Celine, who joined the warrior units, were fine. Daily training and missions burned energy and gave variety. Ordinary vampires, without strict discipline or self-control, slid into decadence, and watching that unfold opened Chris's eyes. The original plan, to have Celine cosplay anime characters, was abandoned almost immediately. After Celine half-reluctantly agreed, Chris had tasted vampire decadence for himself. For 2.5 days, he soaked up the strange, refined knowledge these creatures had accumulated over centuries. There were a few practices he found too bizarre to try, but otherwise he and Celine learned everything. That way, the strange lore of the vampires would be carried forward. After reattaching her arm, Celine leaned against Chris's shoulder, savoring the moment. "My dear, are you sure you don't want to keep going?" she asked. Chris involuntarily shivered, his back muscles tensing and pushing her away. He answered in a heavy tone, "A real man isn't lost in pleasures. I've already wasted too much time with you. I have serious business to do." Celine's expression flickered between amusement and confusion. She glanced at him, then down at his lower body, and saw he was perfectly fine. Chris noticed and flushed, immediately standing up a little defensively. "What are you staring at? I'm fine. It's just that these past 2 days have been ridiculous. This is wasting our lives." "Heh heh," Celine scoffed. Who started this, she thought, him or her? She'd only just discovered the delights and wasn't about to stop. The idea of going it alone crossed her mind, but with her current stamina that would be impractical. She looked at Chris with soft, moist eyes that pulled at him, but he turned his head away. "Don't look at me like that. My body is fine, but my mind is exhausted. I need to rest." He wasn't lying. No matter how strong his body, facing a vampire with the ability to siphon life force was draining. Even if he physically overpowered Celine, she could convert his vitality into her own, coming back stronger. Over the past 2 days, he'd beaten her only to have her drink in high-grade life energy and rebound, a pattern that happened more than once. Chris dreaded interrupting his streak of victories. He'd painstakingly built an unbeaten run of over 1,000 matches. A careless loss now would be humiliating. Better to rest, rebuild reserves, and then continue. He also had other concerns. Vampires were not few in number. Besides Celine's group, there were many scattered across European nations, and there were werewolves to bolster their ranks. 3 days earlier, he'd sent Lucien to handle something, but hadn't heard back. This was a perfect chance to teach a disobedient dog a lesson. He dressed Celine with determination and dragged her out of the fortress that still smelled faintly of their fights. "Let's drive. With our stamina and speed, walking is too slow." Celine, puzzled, got behind the wheel and followed his directions toward where Lucien might be. Chris closed his eyes and fell silent, as if concentrating on locating Lucien. He didn't need to strain. His enhanced destiny sense had already locked on to Lucien's position. All he had to do was choose the road. He kept quiet partly because he didn't want to finish the job too quickly. He still couldn't quite reconcile how aloof, goddess-like Celine had become so passionate and intense. He needed time and space to recover. By insisting on driving himself, he could slow things down and give her something to do so she wouldn't cling to him. Celine noticed something in his manner. She eyed him warily, but found nothing outwardly wrong and dismissed the thought. Still, since she'd drunk his blood, their relationship had subtly shifted. Chris wasn't sure if she felt it, but he certainly did. A faint, strange connection. At times he seemed to feel Celine's perceptions in sync with his own, as if she had become part of his senses. When he first discovered that, he'd been curious, even adventurous, and tried things that belonged only in fantasy. Those experiments, however, had left him mentally exhausted. He'd used that as an excuse to rest. Beneath his composure, Chris worried. What if this bond was the start of mind reading? If so, future interactions with other women might become doubly taxing. The thought of enduring simultaneous streams of perception terrified him. He might have to cut down on such encounters. For now, though, it seemed likely that the connection came from Celine drinking his blood, combined with the powers he'd absorbed from the vampire progenitor Marcus and Celine's own vampiric nature. Until he verified that, he couldn't shake the added pressure weighing on him. 169. Untamable dogs. Celine had no idea how much pressure Chris was under, and Chris had no clue about Lucien's scheming. Even though Chris could read minds, human thoughts twisted and turned. One idea could be replaced by a completely different one in an instant. The dog that had been obedient under Chris's attention went wild the moment he stopped watching it. Rewind to the start of Chris and Celine's ranked match, when Lucien had just returned to the wolf den. The werewolves who had been routed by Celine's team and fled had gathered back at the den, but Lucien's absence had left them uneasy. When Lucien finally appeared among them, their spirits ignited at once. "Lucien, you're back!" Seeing his tribesmen rally around him eased much of the frustration he had felt toward Chris. Lucien smiled and placated them. "Of course I'm fine, and I've got good news." Under Lucien's reassurance, the wolves quieted and listened. "The vampire clan, led by Marcus and Victor, has been wiped out. We've won a decisive victory." For a moment, the den fell completely silent. Even breathing was barely audible. Then the information broke through their stunned faces, and shouts rose up. Wolf King! Wolf King! Those bloodsuckers in the gutters were nothing. This world will belong to us, the wolf tribe." Lucien watched them celebrate with a smile on his face, but inside he felt hollow. He could never be sure where the werewolves stood in Chris's mind. Victor's clan had been annihilated because of something Chris thought, even when Chris had favored Celine. If Lucien could not win Chris's favor himself, and if the werewolves offered no utilitarian value to him, how would Chris treat them? Would they end up as his lackeys, as Lucian had suggested. The questions churned in Lucian's chest, but with the gulf of power between them, he couldn't find answers. Once his tribesmen calmed, Lucian set them to work on the tasks Chris had set. Even though Victor's clan is gone, other vampires remain. One of the 3 great vampire elders is still alive. We can't let our guard down. Tell us what to do, leader. We'll follow, they answered eagerly. The super werewolf project must continue. Michael must be captured and brought here. And I've heard that the first immortal Alexander is still alive. We need to locate him as well. The researcher, the most intelligent among the werewolves, immediately took the news seriously. If Alexander is alive, our super werewolf research can go farther. Lucian produced a small bottle of dragon blood potion and handed it to the researcher. The man turned it over curiously. What is this? It can make us stronger. I don't have the formula and only have this one bottle. See if you can decipher it and reproduce more. Lucian himself didn't know the potion's origin. Chris hadn't told him, but he'd seen its effects on himself and knew it was a strategic resource. The researcher examined the bottle. Aside from a label with the name DeBroad, there were no other identifiers. Do your best, Lucian said lightly when he saw the researcher's hesitation. If you can't, it's all right. With their orders given, the werewolves dispersed. With the vampires no longer interfering, their actions were unhindered. They found Michael within a few hours. He was in terrible shape, near death by any measure. The wolves did not delay and brought him back to the den, awaiting Lucian's decision. Michael lay trembling on a bed, confusion in his eyes. Lucian examined him and couldn't fathom the man's condition, but he knew one thing for certain: a dead Michael would not satisfy Chris. He summoned the researcher for an examination. After a thorough check, the researcher reported, his condition is very serious. After you bit him, leader, he acquired the werewolf bloodline, but his bloodline is unusual. It's currently clashing with the werewolf traits. He can't transform, and he can't revert. He's in a kind of stasis. Lucian frowned, then nodded. So he's evolving toward the super werewolf we imagined, but he's missing the vampire bloodline. Exactly. The researcher looked at Michael with regret. Lucian had admitted to storming the vampire stronghold and killing those inside. There might be other vampires in the city, but they were hiding and would be hard to find quickly. Without a vampire bloodline to initiate the change, Michael's chances of surviving and of becoming the super species they dreamed of were slim. The regret among the researchers and scientists was genuine. A potential breakthrough was slipping away. Lucian kept his face calm, but inside a huge wave of possibility was rising. If he could control the super werewolf project, maybe he could push back against Chris's dominance. Find Amelia's location, he ordered. The vampires are about to transfer their power, and she doesn't yet know about Victor and the others. Where is she now? The researcher hesitated a beat, then understood. He pulled up the monitors and queried the werewolves assigned to watch Amelia. When the super werewolf project had been deemed feasible, they had made thorough preparations. To create a super werewolf, they needed not only a direct descendant of Alexander to act as a fusion agent, but also a vampire bloodline, at least as strong as their own, to trigger the transformation. Only a handful of vampires had bloodlines that could match Lucian's. Amelia had been one of the chosen. Their plan had been delayed by Celine's interference and Chris's sudden arrival, but the operatives they had dispatched were still out there, carrying on their mission. 170. Super Hybrid. After some questioning, Amelia's location was confirmed. According to our informant, Amelia is en route and should arrive at the station tonight at midnight. Lucian's eyes flickered at the news. He made a decision on the spot. Make sure that man stays alive. He can't die before I get back. With that, Lucian gathered a few elite werewolves and left the den. He was going out to fight for their freedom. At the train station where Amelia was due, Lucian sat casually on a bench along the platform. The dragon blood potion Chris had given him and the baptism of brutal combat that followed had fully unlocked his werewolf potential. His strength now exceeded his old power by an order of magnitude, enough to carve through a vampire stronghold like it was nothing. Even facing a vampire elder at her peak, Lucian felt no fear. His men, however, were more unsettled. Reputation and prudence made them nervous. They were about to confront a vampire elder with her guards. They trusted Lucien to protect himself, but they were right to worry about their own safety. One of the men hesitated. "Leader, it's almost time. Shouldn't we set an ambush?" Lucien looked up at his worried face. He was about to reassure them when a distant roar announced a train pulling into the station. The werewolves' faces changed. They all turned to Lucien, waiting for orders. Lucien rose slowly. "Stand by," he said. "Watch carefully. You'll have work to do." Before the subordinate could press him further, Lucien launched toward the incoming train. Hundreds of meters closed in the blink of an eye. By the time the others reacted, Lucien had already shifted into his wolf form. A colossal wolf, 7 or 8 meters tall, towering over the train, hurtled into the carriage with speed the others could barely imagine. The impact detonated across the platform. Several cars lurched off the tracks. The car Lucien had aimed at was torn free and flung more than 10 meters, slamming onto the opposite platform. The driver and a few attendants died in the blast, but none of the vampires on board were immediately killed. Amelia, one of the 3 great vampire elders, reacted instantly and counterattacked. "Damn Victor, why didn't he tell me there was a super werewolf here?" she spat, cursing the dead man. She raised 2 submachine guns and opened fire. Seeing the enormous wolf, she had no intention of getting close. She backed away through a shattered window and trained her weapons on Lucien's face, aiming for his eyes. The bullet sprang forward, only to meet Lucien's closed eyelids. He shut his eyes, the rounds hit his face and ricocheted as if off steel. Amelia's retreat didn't gain her enough distance. Before she could put real space between them, Lucien leapt. Her centuries-honed strength and practiced technique were useless against him. Lucien ripped at her bat-like wings as easily as plucking a fly's wings from the air, tearing them away. "Ah, you beast!" she screamed. Pressed under a massive wolf paw, Amelia was thrown against the concrete. Her skull fractured, eyes bulged, bones shattered. Had it not been for the vampire elder's prodigious vitality, she would have been reduced to a husk. Still, the blow left her on the brink. The remaining vampires in the carriage saw what had happened and scattered for their lives. They were no match. As Lucien shrank back toward human size, he moved with frightening speed, and any vampire who hadn't fled from the train car was decapitated in seconds. 10 heartbeats later, Lucien's elite werewolves caught up. They stood stunned, hardly believing the devastation Lucien had wrought. It wasn't until Lucien returned to human form and barked, "What are you waiting for? Collect the blood," that they snapped out of their shock. They swarmed Amelia with specially made syringes, trembling as they tried to harvest what she had left. Lucien's strike had been brutal. She had lost much blood, and it took them longer than they'd hoped to extract enough. From the moment the train entered the station to Lucien's attack, Amelia's counter, and her collapse, the confrontation had lasted less than 10 seconds. Harvesting the blood consumed most of the time. Back at the den, they wasted no time. Michael was strapped to the operating table, trembling. The researcher held a syringe filled with Amelia's blood and hesitated, looking to Lucien for confirmation. He had a hypothesis he wanted to test, but he was anxious, fear of the unknown and of failure. Lucien's steady, determined gaze dispelled the researcher's doubts. With Lucien's unspoken permission, he plunged the syringe into Michael's arm. As the vampire elder's blood entered Michael's veins, his shudders slowed. His body calmed, and soon he slipped into a deep, uneasy coma. Lucien watched anxiously. "How is it? Was the experiment successful?" The researcher blinked, still a little dazed, and checked the instruments. "Life signs are stable. The 2 bloodlines are merging. His vitality is increasing." "Good, excellent." Lucien clenched his fists and let out an excited shout. The researcher assumed Lucien's elation was only about the experiment's success and paid it little mind. Lucien, however, had bigger plans. He looked at Michael's rising strength and said without hesitation, "Prepare the potion. I'm going in next." "Ah!" The researcher stared, baffled. All 3 vampire elders were now gone. There was no one left in the vampire hierarchy to rival Lucien. Without the elders' leadership, the clan's decline seemed inevitable. Why risk more? Why gamble on pushing his power further when he already stood uncontested? The researcher wanted to test and verify safety first, but Lucien was unmoved. His voice was firm. "Prepare it now. I want to undergo the experiment immediately." Frightened by the intensity of Lucien's aura, the researcher scrambled to his feet. "Yes, leader," he answered, hurrying to obey. Dinosaurs. Wolves? With Michael's case as a reference, the researcher had quickly finished a qualified evolution potion. Lucien looked at the syringe in his hand, didn't hesitate, and plunged it into his arm. Ugh! The genetic transformation tore through him. Lucien howled as pain lanced his body. He felt his muscles swell, his senses sharpen. Instinct took over, and he shifted toward his werewolf form, about to unleash a triumphant howl to test his new power, when the change abruptly faded. The surge ebbed, and the evolution stopped. No, what's going on? Why is this all it did? Lucien's glare chilled the researcher to the bone. Leader, I don't know. Please let me examine you. The researcher's voice trembled. Lucien, though furious, knew he couldn't blame his subordinate. He swallowed his anger. I need an answer. Now. Those icy words made the researcher hurry. He set up instruments and ran every test he could on Lucien's genes. When the results came back, he nearly exhaled with relief, not because the potion was perfect, but because it wasn't defective. He placed 3 reports in front of Lucien. Leader, look, this is Amelia's gene strength, this is your gene strength, and this is the strength rating for the potion I made. Amelia's genes registered A grade. The potion measured A+. Lucien's gene report read S grade. The researcher explained what that meant. He had assumed Lucien, as a second-generation werewolf descended from William, would be roughly equivalent to Amelia, a second-generation vampire, compatible and of comparable grade. Combining their lines with the enhancements he'd engineered should have driven Lucien up to progenitor level, maybe even beyond. In the researcher's system, progenitors like the vampire and werewolf founders normally tested A+. He had expected to complete Lucien's genome to that A+ standard, but Lucien's genes were already beyond that, S grade, far superior to the A+ benchmark. That was why the potion only produced a brief spike. The formula could have been transformative for an A or A+ grade subject, but against an S grade being, it amounted to an adrenaline shot, noticeable but fleeting. Lucien processed the information and felt hollow. He'd hoped to use the potion to evolve enough to face Chris. Instead, the effect was negligible. Even if his power was multiplied by 10, generous, he thought, his maximum output would climb from about 3 tons to roughly 30. That might be enough to rout a vampire elder, but against Chris, who made him feel immeasurably outclassed, 30 tons was meaningless. He let out a long, bitter sigh. If this was the truth, werewolves would remain second class, slaves or servants under someone stronger. When the 3 vampire elders were around, they'd suffered under vampire dominance. With them gone, would some new monster simply take their place? Lucien stared at his hands, struggling with the thought that their fate might be to bow to another master. The researcher watched him, puzzled by the sadness he couldn't explain. He remembered how driven Lucien had been by revenge and the pursuit of power. Now that revenge had been achieved, he expected relief, not despair. Then the researcher's mind shifted to Alexander. As one of the few learned werewolves, he knew Marcus and William were both children of the immortal Alexander. Lucien had said he killed Marcus. If that was true, it implied a direct clash with Alexander himself. The realization made the researcher uneasy. Alexander's power, amplified by centuries and by his status as an immortal, would dwarf even the progenitors of the werewolves and vampires. If Alexander took offense, the bright future the researcher had envisioned for their kind could be snuffed out. He cleared his throat. Leader, about that peculiar bottle you gave me. I ran some tests. Those are irrelevant. Do what you want with it. Lucien's tone was flat. Knowing he could not yet stand against Chris, he'd lost interest in any of the trappings of power. If submission was inevitable, there was no point clinging to pride. He'd rather figure out how to ease his people into it than chase lost victories. The researcher hesitated, then pushed on. He felt he owed Lucien every possible option. I analyzed that potion. It isn't ordinary. It's an enhancement serum synthesized from dinosaur genes using very advanced genetic engineering. At the words dinosaur genes and enhancement serum, Lucien's attention snapped back into focus. The rest of the explanation blurred into the background as those 2 phrases lodged in his mind. 172. Genetic hodgepodge. Get to the point. Lucian had already guessed what the researcher was about to say, but he still wanted confirmation from a professional. He'd been counting on the evolution potion to make him powerful enough to resist Chris. The original result had been a disappointment. It had seemed no more effective than the strange potion Chris had casually produced, and perhaps even weaker. He didn't dare let himself hope too much this time. He'd learned how crushing disappointment could turn him into someone who couldn't even contemplate resistance. The researcher, ready to give a long explanation, paused when he saw the sudden change in his leader's mood. It didn't bother him. He was only a subordinate whose job was to propose ideas. Everything else was for Lucian to decide. With that thought, he pushed his doubts aside and spoke smoothly. Based on my analysis of that strengthening potion and the data from your and Michael's evolutions, I'm confident I can make a stronger evolution potion. Good. Start making it now. Tell me what you need, and I'll support you fully. Lucian waved his hand, his eyes bright with resolve. The researcher froze for a moment, then hurriedly added, "Leader, there's only an 80% chance of success, and it will take at least a day to cultivate the genes. I'm not sure of the consequences of using this genetic potion. You doing this?" Lucian put a hand on the researcher's shoulder and cut him off. "It's fine. I need strength now. Time is against me. Go ahead and do it. If it fails, it's my fate." Chris hadn't given Lucian a deadline, but Lucian had already been away more than a day without reporting in. That would raise suspicion in anyone, especially since Lucian had only surrendered less than a day earlier. He'd made two plans. If the gene potion worked, he would rebel and declare that werewolves would never be slaves. If it didn't, he'd take Michael to find Chris to prove he'd been doing his job. The first evolution potion had failed to meet his expectations, so he'd prepared to carry out the second plan. Then the researcher proposed the new potion, and everything got complicated. Lucian didn't know whether Chris would track him down before the new potion was ready, or whether its effects would be any better. In the end, his desire for freedom won. He refused to return to a life where he didn't control his own fate. Even a small chance was worth everything. Luck was with him. Chris seemed to have forgotten about him. Lucian suspected the vampire woman's charm had ensnared that monster. Despite that, he didn't slow the experiment. When the new evolution potion was ready, he refused the researcher's suggestion to run tests and injected it himself. The genetic shift hit him like a storm, stronger than before. His body flared with heat and moisture boiled away from within. The researcher saw it and rushed for water, but Lucian's mutation had already begun. Clothes tore aside as the werewolf transformation took hold, but it didn't stop at a normal transformation. Huge bony ridges erupted from his massive wolf skull, making his beastly face even more ferocious. His body shifted toward something more savage and brutal. His hind limbs thickened, his narrow waist braced by solid, plate-like bones, and his claws lengthened and sharpened. Up close, the claws were studded with countless tiny barbs, like lethal serrations. By the time the researcher returned with a bucket, the change had finished. Lucian's new form was only a little bulkier than his previous werewolf shape, far smaller than the titanic 7-meter form he'd taken after the dragon blood potion. Back when he'd first transformed, he'd been roughly 3 meters tall. The dragon blood had doubled him to over 7. Now, after the new evolution potion, he stood just over 2 meters. Still, feeling the changes, Lucian smiled with a grim, unsettling satisfaction. The researcher, also a werewolf and not afraid of his leader, set the bucket down and asked, curious, "Leader, what level of strength have you reached now? Can you deal with the threat from Alexander?" "Alexander?" Lucian's face registered confusion. What did that have to do with the coward who never showed himself? The researcher's question made sense only if he'd assumed Lucian had killed Marcus and feared Alexander's revenge. Lucian didn't bother to correct him. Instead, he made a demonstrative gesture. His sharpened claws slashed through the operating table in front of him without effort. The raw increase in strength wasn't as dramatic as Lucian had hoped, about 3 times his previous power, roughly a little over 100 tons. What surprised him was the speed. Perhaps because vampires were naturally fast, Lucian now felt that killing his former self would be easier than killing a vampire. Beyond the measurable gains, the strange dinosaur-like genes seemed to grant new talents, an endless rush of vitality and heightened capacity for taking in external information. Those changes filled him with confidence. Even if he couldn't beat Chris outright, he believed he could escape and survive. 173. What is beast instinct? Chris had no idea what Lucien had been doing for the past 2 days. If he had known how hard Lucien had been pushing himself, he would have been proud. After all, being a villain boss had always been one of Chris's ambitions. Unfortunately, because Chris came from a comedic universe, he lacked the ability to inspire a truly oppressive dread. What kind of villain boss still practiced his moves while the protagonist was getting stronger? When Chris led Celine to drive into the ruined factory and they climbed out, both of them looked up, puzzled. "You really found a way to track me. Looks like my worries were justified," Lucien said from the top of the water tower, his figure cloaked in a black trench coat. His voice was low. He had finished his evolution the night before, but even after feeling the staggering change in his power, he hadn't dared to seek Chris out. He was equally afraid Chris might find him, so Lucien had left his pack and hidden alone in this desolate factory. It was the perfect place to get used to his new strength, and it was far enough from others that if he had to fight, the human wave tactics his pack might use wouldn't cost them their lives. He planned to handle this himself first. If he failed, his only option would be to leave his homeland and cut off contact with his pack so they might survive. In that decision, there was a complete transformation. Before his revenge, his pack had lived for him. After, he would live for them. That was the only way he could earn the title of Wolf King. Chris heard all the meaning packed into Lucien's 2 sentences clearly. He could read minds and sense emotions. Even though Lucien had only spoken briefly, Chris understood the intentions behind them. But understanding didn't breed sympathy. Since arriving in this world, no one had died because of him except Marcus, whom Chris had killed with his own hands. Celine leading the attack on the wolf den was a chain of events that would have happened without him. Taking Celine and Lucien to the vampire stronghold was fate already set between them and the vampires. Even without Chris, these things would have occurred. Chris had healed Lucien, helped him grow stronger, and even accompanied him to exact revenge. He had done him nothing but favors. Even his insults were jokes. Lucien's apparent ingratitude burned Chris. All the mind-reading in the world confirmed Lucien's resolve, but that only made Chris want to kill him more. He looked up at the backlit figure on the tower, shining like some martyr, and snarled with petty jealousy. "How pretentious! Don't make any clownish speeches when you die." He hadn't even started dying yet. How could the dog he raised be more pretentious than him? Chris shoved off the ground and launched himself in a rocket headbutt straight at Lucien. The blast of air threw Celine back as he flew. In an instant, he closed dozens of meters. With Chris's weight and velocity, nothing physical could withstand the impact of his charge. In his imagination, Lucien would be smashed into a bloody mist, feeding the earth, and Chris and Celine would walk away, sparing Lucien's pack out of some perverse respect for Lucien's loyalty. But as soon as Chris left the ground, Lucien's body moved in sympathy. Lucien's speed had improved since his evolution, but it still couldn't match Chris. When Chris charged like a human cannonball, Lucien realized he couldn't even see Chris's outline in the blur. What unnerved him more, though, was that despite not seeing Chris, his evolved body's beastly instinct and almost precognitive intuition let him dodge the impact at the last moment. "Are you cheating?" Chris shouted as he flipped into the air and slapped the air to change direction, charging again. Lucien's movements were strange. His speed seemed inferior, yet he managed perfect, hairbreadth dodges right before Chris's blows landed. Unable to make contact, Chris changed tactics. If fists and feet couldn't reach him, he would use the environment. He struck at the air itself. Boom! Thunder rolled across the old water tower. Lucien's near precognition let him avoid direct hits, but he couldn't escape the air that Chris was manipulating. Chris not only outstripped him in speed, his strength was on another level. When Chris slammed his power into the atmosphere, the air around them became violently turbulent. Chris's strength exceeded 300 tons, and with acceleration many times greater than the speed of sound, he unleashed an almost incomprehensible force. The temperature surged into the thousands of degrees. Lucian's clothes flared, his skin began to scorch. Satisfied that the tactic worked, Chris narrowed his focus and poured more power into the air surrounding Lucian. The turbulence intensified into razor-like currents, slicing through space and slashing at bodies caught within. The shockwaves cut continuously, never giving Lucian a moment's rest. Chris's healing and recovery were on a different scale. In the inferno he'd created, he remained unscathed. Lucian was not so lucky. Thousands of degrees evaporated moisture from his flesh, while tens of thousands of shockwaves shredded him. The relentless forces Chris directed left Lucian's nerves no time to recover. After a few breaths, Chris felt the confirmation of his devour talent. A small orange-red sphere of light merged into his body. With that sign, he stopped thrashing the air and let himself fall. Freed from his assault, the crazed air mass slowly dispersed. Lucian fell out of it, landing hard, but he was no longer the man who had climbed the tower. His body was charred black as coal, huge patches of bluish-black flesh exposed. Any trace of his original face was obscured. The corpse was nearly unrecognizable. 174. Accounting. Chris! Celine sprinted over, panic on her face. The whole thing had happened so fast, she hadn't even reacted before Chris was already grappling with Lucian. By the time she realized what was happening, thunder and fire had ripped through the sky, their violent energy keeping her at a distance. Before she could think of a way to help, the roaring overhead stopped. Celine watched Chris fall from that ball of flame and thunder and rushed to him. When she found him unharmed, she finally let out a long breath. "I'm fine." Chris stepped forward, hugged her, and soothed her gently, then moved to Lucian's body. The man was completely charred, smelling faintly of roasted meat. Even so, the cells in his flesh were stubbornly trying to repair themselves, twitching and knitting at the edges. In Chris's view, it was useless. Lucian was truly dead. His brain had been cooked, incapable of producing a single measurable thought. His life force had been consumed into Chris's power. There was no coming back. "What a physique," Chris muttered. He far exceeded the usual scale of vampires and werewolves. Celine watched the smoldering husk with a strange admiration. The body had apparently begun to heal itself, but there was no sign of life. Lucian lay like a log. Celine couldn't sense a soul. "What's his situation? Why can't I feel his soul?" "Maybe I ate it," Chris said offhandedly. Celine blinked, incredulous, as if he were joking. Chris saw the look and grinned. "All right, that was a joke." Celine forced a shaky smile. She had the uneasy feeling he hadn't been joking, but after only 3 days of knowing him and so much already happening between them, she didn't press it. Instead, she changed the subject. "What do you want to do next? Take over the vampires and werewolves?" Thanks to Victor, Celine had nothing but distrust for vampires. If she could, she would vanish from that world entirely, hide her identity, and live as a human. Chris's presence, however, kept her from such extremes. Chris hesitated. He didn't have a plan either. He wasn't close to leaving this world. He was still too entangled in it, so he needed something to occupy his time. After a moment, he looked at Lucian's restored corpse. Let's find his subordinates first. To have made him that powerful, they must have capable people among the werewolves. Celine shrugged off her trench coat and laid it over Lucian. Chris picked the body up and slotted it into the trunk. From what he knew, Lucian's leap in strength had to be tied to the Super Werewolf Project in the original timeline. If that was the case, Michael, the key to that project, must be in the hands of those werewolves. Find Michael's location, and they'd find the lair. They tracked the scent to an abandoned military base. Celine snapped on her tactical belt, checked her firearms and ammunition, looking every bit the lethal hunter. "Cool," Chris said with a thumbs up, "but your weapons aren't powerful enough. Use mine." Celine raised an eyebrow as Chris produced a blast gun from his wristband. Silver nitrate rounds worked against werewolves, but Chris favored raw firepower. With enough force, any undead could be destroyed. He handed her the weapon and showed her the basics. She picked it up instantly. Chris wasn't worried about recoil. Celine was a vampire, and her immortality would protect her from the worst of it. Inside the base, a group of elite werewolves had gathered, restless and uneasy. Lucian had ordered them to hide there, but no one knew why. "Sing, do you know why the leader went out alone?" one of them asked, glancing toward the researcher in a white lab coat. Sing, the scientist who had developed the evolution serum, felt the room's eyes on him and swallowed. I thought he was going after Alexander," he began, "but now I think he wasn't afraid of Alexander. He seemed afraid of something even more terrifying." Something more terrifying? The speaker looked baffled. He had hunted with Lucian and seen what Lucian could do. How could anything be stronger? The idea that Lucian had injected himself with Sing's serum before facing an unknown threat was hard to accept. "Are you making this up? How could something be stronger than the leader, and how could the leader have needed your serum?" Others scoffed. Sing flushed. He knew his theory sounded exaggerated. Still, based on Lucian's behavior, it was the only explanation that fit. He decided to stay quiet while they accused him. One of the werewolves, curiosity cutting through the noise, turned to the young man bound nearby. "Why didn't you use this guy's blood to make more serum? He seemed like a successful evolutionary sample." Sing went pale. He hadn't thought of that. He'd already said everything he could think of. To create a serum the leader could use, he had poured all the available vampire blood into Amelia's blood as a nutrient. There was no vampire blood left to make more evolution serum. The room fell still as that fact settled in. Singer had never imagined that these rude, brutal kin would show a spark of intelligence that would make him take notice. He hadn't been away from them for long, only a few hours, and if he could produce enough evolution serum quickly to help the elite lichens complete their transformation, they would be in his debt and able to help Lucian. With that thought, Singer didn't waste any more time. He picked up his tools and moved to Michael, turning the poor man over. With Michael's back to him, Singer raised the bone marrow extractor, ready to harvest the materials for the serum. Michael twitched in his sleep, perhaps sensing a threat. He did not have the energy to fight the suppressants keeping him sedated. The motion was only a brief muscle spasm before he settled again. Singer didn't notice. Just as the needle was about to be inserted into Michael's spine, a violent explosion shattered the silence. The steel door blew inward, leaving a jagged gap. The blast threw up a choking cloud of dust that instantly filled the base. "Enemy attack!" one lichen shouted, trying to warn the others. Through the smoke, the lichens could see nothing and scrambled for cover using only instinct and previous impressions. Celine, blinded by the dust, couldn't see their positions either, until that shout revealed one of them. Selene didn't hesitate. She raised the blast gun and fired. The muzzle erupted, and a lichen who had just warned his pack was blasted apart in a spray of blood. The old base filled with the metallic tang of iron and the thunder of the shot. "Good shot," someone called out. Dust couldn't stop Chris's perceptions. Even with his sight impaired, his other senses painted the scene. Celine bristled at the compliment. She had just seen what the blast gun could do. Its shot could punch through an iron door dozens of centimeters thick. With that explosive power, there was little need for precise aim. Still, Chris's praise was genuine, so she didn't dwell on it. She fired again, shooting toward any suspicious sound, and the dust only thickened. Muzzle flashes pierced barely an arm's length in the gloom. When Chris stopped her by grabbing her wrist, he said simply, "Enough. There are only a few survivors left." "There are still survivors?" Celine asked, surprised. Without answering, Chris swung his arm in a practiced motion. A gust raced through the room, dispersing much of the smoke until shapes could be made out. A handful of lichens crouched in corners, silent and terrified. Celine drew her pistol and, with efficient clinical shots, took out a few, showing off the marksmanship Chris had praised earlier. Chris smiled and, with an easy flick, caught the blast gun and handed it back. Then he fired once more. The bullet traced a perfect arc and struck the lichen hiding behind Michael in the back of the head. Singer had been using Michael as a human shield, planning to harvest his marrow once Celine's intrusion gave him the chance. Celine had not seen Singer because Michael stood between them, but Chris had. The shot killed Singer instantly. Singer barely managed a plea. The silver nitrate bullet had torn into his neck, but his vitality kept him clinging to life long enough to speak. "I have a method to evolve humans here. If you save." Chris ended him with a single, clean shot to the skull. He had no interest in the Lycan's last words. Between his ability to absorb and read memories and his own quick deductions, Chris already knew what Singer would have said. Convert humans into Lycans first, then inject them with the evolution serum to force an evolution. It was a clumsy, brutal hack to the process. In Chris's view, it was inferior to the other routes to human advancement he had in mind. If humans were to evolve in the best way, Alexander was the ideal direction, something Chris considered the most perfect path. Next came Celine's kind. Daywalkers, vampires refined to correct genetic defects. Finally, there was Michael's hybrid form, a mixture of Lycan and vampire blood. Chris knew which path he preferred and the next steps he would take. Celine, I know what we need to do next. 176. The beginning of a new era. Michael woke in a blur, rolling eyes and a hollow head as the car sped along. Ever since Lucian's attack, he had felt off. Even the evolutionary serum hadn't immediately snapped him out of his coma. Now he was awake, but disoriented. The driver was a cool, composed woman, and sitting beside him was a broad man who towered over him by a full head. Excuse me, Michael began haltingly, unsure where to start. Chris, sensing his confusion and the jumble of thoughts clouding Michael's mind, cut him off. Don't ask, I'll tell you everything. Just listen, and don't waste time with questions. Go ahead, Michael said, sitting up. At first his whole body ached, but moments later he became aware of a new, inexhaustible strength and sharpened senses. He could even hear the driver's breathing from the seats ahead. It made him both uneasy and intensely curious. Celine's driving skills, like her marksmanship, had been honed for a lifetime. As a vampire with enhanced physicality and reflexes, she handled the car with flawless control. After some time, guided by Chris, she steered them to a private dock. This was Alexander Corvinus's hideout in the modern age. By then, Chris had already walked Michael through what had happened, but the sheer scope of it left Michael feeling like he'd been dropped into a fantasy novel. Werewolves, vampires, an original immortal, and the shocking revelation that Michael was supposedly a direct descendant of that immortal's secret third son. Because of his bloodline, he'd been targeted by werewolves, injected with a hybrid serum, and turned into a half-werewolf, half-vampire. It was all absurd, and somehow true. I know your head's spinning, Chris said, but when you meet your ancestor, you'll see this isn't a lie. Michael had no words. He just followed Chris. They were stopped at an iron gate, and Celine moved to break the chains when a squad of fully armed mercenaries arrived. Michael, who had only ever been a hospital orderly, tensed at the sight. Celine went on alert, hand near her weapon. We're not your enemies. Mr. Corvinus asked us to bring them to him, the lead mercenary said, nodding toward their group. The men recognized Celine. Alexander's troops had been cleaning up after his two sons for generations, and these mercenaries were trained specifically by him. They opened the gate and guided Chris, Celine, and Michael inside. Mr. Corvinus is waiting for you, the lead mercenary said. They boarded the ship. The cabin itself radiated a vitality that made Michael uneasy. Only something ancient and powerful could generate that kind of life essence. Guided down a corridor, they entered a richly appointed office. Behind the table sat an old man with deep-set eyes and a weathered face. To Chris, it was obvious. This was Alexander Corvinus, the original immortal. He bore the weary look of someone who treated immortality more as a burden than a blessing. Alexander rose slowly and came around the conference table. He looked at Chris with complicated emotion, then fixed his gaze on Michael. You know what I am? He asked quietly. By blood, you should be my descendant. Michael nodded, feeling awkward. The man before him looked ancient, but if groomed, he might have seemed younger than Michael, a paradox that only added to the strangeness. Alexander's eyes then slid to Celine. Chris, impatient and blunt, cut in. Enough small talk. Transfer your power and your standing in human society to me. Give me a vial of your blood, and then you can go die wherever you like. Alexander blinked. Even with centuries of life, he hadn't encountered someone so brash. He recovered his composure and, calm as ever, asked, Is that all? You don't wish to learn the secret of my immortality? Chris snorted. Don't flatter yourself. If that's immortality, it makes gods who can destroy stars look ridiculous. Alexander's expression darkened. He had been alive for millennia and rarely felt anger flare in him, but this time the insult stung. Still, he kept his plans in mind and sighed. So be it. Marcus is dead, and William's whereabouts should be among the memories she carries. If you can, end his suffering. Celine's face didn't change. When she fed on Victor's blood, she had inherited memories that included William, so she understood what Alexander meant. Alexander motioned to his men and dismissed those he thought unfit to accompany Chris. A few mercenaries bristled, but Alexander intervened and smoothed things over. Some of my people aren't suitable to follow you. I have released them. I hope you won't hold it against me. He picked up a syringe, pierced the crook of his arm, and began to draw blood. Everything I've built in modern times has been remotely controlled for my own reasons. The list and the keys are in the safe, passcode 401. Take them, and you can assume control. Alexander's words tumbled out with the dry practicality of an old man arranging his affairs. Michael felt a sudden, instinctive fear and moved closer to the immortal. By the time he crouched in front of Alexander, the sentries were visible. The man's breathing had become thin, his skin paper-thin and worn. Alexander placed his withered hand gently on Michael's head and smiled, faint and tired. "Young one," he said softly, "that you might carry on my bloodline is enough." As soon as the words left him, Alexander exhaled his last breath. The original immortal, having arranged his last affairs, let go of life by his own will. The room felt colder in that instant, and the beginning of a new era had just begun. 177. A sudden time travel. Alexander's death was anticlimactic. Nothing dramatic occurred to mark the passing of a man who'd lived a legendary life. The sky stayed clear, the sea kept its steady swell, and even Chris and the others, who had watched his final breath, felt no cataclysmic shift. If anyone was shaken, it was Michael. He had just learned that an ancestor of his had lived for over 1,000 years, and then, in the next instant, that ancestor had chosen to die. The revelation and the subsequent calm left him utterly baffled. Chris, ever practical, snapped Michael out of his daze. "Take whatever inheritance your ancestor left," he said. "We're about to usher this world into a new era." Michael picked up the vial of blood Alexander had drawn. Celine went to the safe and began retrieving the many items inside. They were about to leave when the world stopped. Time froze. From the void poured an infinite light that filled everything. A choir of hymns began as if the world itself were greeting a divine arrival. The oddest thing was that Chris could still move. He turned to check Celine and Michael. Both of them were motionless, as if their thought waves had been snuffed out. Chris kicked a nearby chair out of curiosity. His foot hurt, as if he'd kicked ancient bedrock. The chair didn't budge. Even stranger, the air around him briefly responded to his movements in ways he couldn't explain. He was about to investigate further when a white-bearded old man descended through the light, radiating holiness. Seeing him, all of Chris's questions started to fall into place. "I say, old man," Chris said, dry amusement in his voice. "Isn't this entrance a bit over the top? Freezing time and calling up hymns. Seriously?" The old man hadn't yet spoken when a handsome young figure trailing him snapped, "Impudent." Flames flared from the youth's eyes. Thunder and lightning spat from his mouth, aiming to annihilate Chris on the spot. At the moment the bolt would have struck, displeasure flashed across the old man's face. The judgment fire that could incinerate everything and the universe-splitting thunder simply vanished, as if they had never been. The young man, breathless with surprise, fell to his knees. "My almighty father, please forgive your ignorant child." "Sk, Uriel, I told you not to follow me. Now what do you suggest we do?" the old man chided, tilting his head as if seeking the kneeling angel's counsel. In Uriel's mind replayed a private grievance. He'd begged to accompany the old man out of pride and envy, wanting the same freedom Gabriel enjoyed. When he saw this mortal's disrespect, he had been ready to punish him to earn the father's favor. But now he had flattered the wrong person and incurred the father's displeasure. A faint, darker thought, wondering whether God had deliberately allowed this, flickered in Uriel, but was immediately extinguished by his own radiant nature. Uriel never realized the thought's brief existence, though God did. God's voice softened. "Gabriel is already struggling with Samael's deeds. Go offer him assistance." "Father?" Uriel's voice cracked between obligation and delight. God waved a hand. Uriel vanished. The surrounding hymns faded with him. Without that celestial accompaniment, the old man lost none of his composure, but his presence shrank from cosmic to familiar. With a soft exhale, he transformed into the robust postman Chris knew. Chris stared, baffled. The old man, now in the form he always took when walking the world, walked to Alexander's wine cabinet, chose a bottle, and poured himself a glass. "Want some?" he asked, holding out the bottle. This was a god pouring wine. Chris hesitated for half a beat, then said sharply, "Yes." The idea of a god offering him wine was too ridiculous to pass up. Angels and demons would be green with envy if they heard it. Before Chris could bask in the thought, God sneered, "You are unworthy," and slammed the bottle to the floor. The cork exploded, and more than half the wine blossomed into a dazzling red flower. It unfolded and wrapped Alexander's body, lifting his spirit from the corpse and carrying it heavenward. Chris watched the mythic tableau in stunned silence. "Why does he get into heaven?" he asked finally. God sipped his wine, loosened his belt, and leaned back in Alexander's old chair. "Because I want to," he said simply. Chris had no answer for that. The old man waved a dismissive hand. "Enough idle talk. Young man, get to work. Remember to do a good job. Those others are a real nuisance to me." A circle of light appeared under Chris's feet. He felt himself sinking into it. Panic flared. "Wait, I still have things to finish in this world. Can't you wait until I'm done?" He thrashed and fought as if drowning, but the light held him. God glanced at Celine with a mischievous tilt. "Work quickly, or your little girlfriend will be miserable when she can't find you." "Fa," Chris began, but the sentence broke off as the circle swallowed him. In an instant, he was gone from the world. Chapter 178, Silent Hill, a world that even God had grown irritated with. In a dilapidated church, a group of cultists in strange clothing were carrying out an ancient, malevolent ritual. They had tied a uniformed policewoman to a wooden ladder, preparing a witch burning like something out of the Middle Ages. "Burn the witch," the crowd chanted. A woman who seemed to lead them crouched near the pyre, a faint, satisfied smile on her face as she glared at the small girl beside her. "This is all your fault," she hissed. "If you hadn't made that mistake, none of us would be here, and nobody would have died." Her eyes were hard, her appearance unhinged. Malice seemed to radiate from her. The little girl ignored the accusations and tugged at the ropes, trying to get closer to the officer. It was useless. The officer's face was streaked with blood. The cultists had beaten her and roughly lashed her to the ladder. She sat slumped against the wood like a candle about to gutter out. Through the smoke and searing heat, she managed one strained, tender thought for the girl. "Goodbye, Sharon. You'll have to look out for yourself." Her tenderness meant nothing to the crowd. They hurled curses at anything connected to witches. "Burn the witch! Burn her!" The chanting was suddenly drowned out by another sound. Everyone looked up in surprise at a noise from above. "Cry!" To the astonishment of the cultists and the injured officer, a massive shape crashed through the church ceiling and plummeted toward the pyre. There was a dull, heavy thud as the body hit the floor, scattering the burning wood. Flames leapt and embers flew. A few cultists nearest the blaze were scorched and staggered back, howling. Silence fell. In the center of the scattered fire, they saw a humanoid form, and, impossibly, despite the inferno, the figure seemed alive. "Devil!" someone screamed, and chaos threatened to break loose. But the outside had become a demonic realm, warped by a witch. No one dared run outdoors. They pressed themselves against the walls, terrified. The leading woman tried to reassert control. She stepped forward. "Stop it! It's only a devil. He'll burn in the holy fire. Send the witch's servant in after him, and we'll send them both to hell." Her words calmed some of the panic, but the figure in the flames had not been consumed. The crowd hesitated. The woman moved toward the mechanism that would lower the ladder, determined to push the officer into the blaze herself. She had only taken a couple of steps when the cultists suddenly panicked again and bolted for the doors. "Run! Run! The devil doesn't fear fire!" The ornately dressed leader spun around. From the heart of the pyre strode an extremely muscular young man. He emerged from the flames like an avenging god. "De-devil!" the leader cried, falling to her knees and praying desperately. "Almighty God, save us, your lost lambs." Chris heard her prayer, and remembering the plot of Silent Hill and the instructions he'd been given by God, He understood his mission. Rage flared in him. "So you lot made me do an outdoor mission, huh?" he muttered, then lashed out. He struck the praying woman from a distance. She exploded into a spray of blood. He didn't stop there. Chris moved like a force of nature through the church, seizing cultists, smashing them against pews and rafters. Bodies crumpled and broke under his blows. Bones and gore sprayed as their skulls and ribs shattered. After crushing 7 or 8 people in rapid succession, the rest of the cultists were no longer a threat. Only 2 alive remained, stunned and speechless in the wake of the slaughter. The little girl, Sharon, stood there dazed and hollow-eyed, as if her soul had been plucked from her. The policewoman on the ladder stared in disbelief, unable to understand who this blood-soaked deliverer was or how the mob had been turned to ash so suddenly. Chris had no time to dwell on their shock. They were not the targets of God's wrath. In the original timeline, they had been victims who needed saving. Once he was satisfied they were out of immediate danger, he shouted up toward the sky, "Old man, I'm done. Send me back." There was no immediate response. Sharon blinked, and seeing that this stranger meant them no harm, crept forward to the ladder. She looked up at the bound officer, then at Chris. She realized that if she simply untied the ropes, the injured woman couldn't hold on and might fall. Timidly, she approached Chris and looked at him with pleading eyes. Could you help get her down?" Chris looked at the small, haunted child and thought over what he might still owe the old man. Then, remembering the story he was inside, he leapt up onto the ladder. The officer's eyes widened at the sight of him. With a single motion, he ripped the ropes free and, cradling the limp woman in his arms, jumped down from the ladder to the floor. "Thank you," Sharon whispered, as she hurried to check the officer's wounds. Chris stood there for a moment, looking up at the broken ceiling and the dead cultists, wondering where he'd failed to please God and why he was still stranded in this cursed town. 179. Redemption. The reason God had given for sending Chris to this world was that a group of people here kept pestering him with relentless prayers. God had said Chris would know what to do once he arrived. At first, Chris assumed those cultists' constant supplications were annoying God, and that, not wanting to intervene directly, God had sent an outsider, a mercenary, to deal with the dirty work. But even after Chris eliminated the cultists, God remained silent. That made Chris suspect the divine explanation might not be so simple. A female police officer, leaning on a little girl for support, limped up to Chris and said gratefully, "Thank you for your help, but we have someone else missing, Sharon's mother. Could you help us find her?" Chris looked at Sharon. The girl was filthy, clearly beaten by hardship, but her soul radiated a gentle, luminous pulse, like an angel misplaced in the mortal world. Seeing her, memories of this world's recurring motifs cropped up in Chris's mind. No matter the version, the background always circled back to a tragedy involving a group of cultists trying to burn a little girl as a sacrifice. The dark god in most tellings was Samael, the once favored child of God who became the fallen angel, Lucifer. George tried to follow that thread. Was Lucifer meddling in this reality, and had God sent him to stop it? The thought amused him. What was he? His raw strength didn't exceed 1,000 tons, his knowledge of the occult was practically zero, and he was not particularly cunning. If Lucifer were truly involved, God would have sent an archangel or a Constantine-like human, not him. The notion that Chris was here to handle something Lucifer-sized seemed absurd. He shook his head and let out a short, disbelieving chuckle. Sybil and Sharon exchanged a look. The man who had saved them seemed odd. Maybe he'd hit his head. But since he had helped, neither pressed it. Chris forced himself not to overthink and simply nodded. "All right. I don't have anything else right now. I'll help you look." "Thank you again, brave sir. I'm Sybil, a police officer from Silent Hill. This is Sharon. The person missing is her mother, Rose." Sybil introduced herself earnestly. Sharon managed a faint, tentative smile. She instinctively kept her distance from Chris. For reasons she couldn't name, she felt uneasy around him. She stayed tucked behind Sybil, both to support the officer and to avoid the discomfort the man seemed to bring. Chris didn't dwell on Sharon's awkwardness. He knew there was something special about the girl's soul, but he had faith in the divine decree that nothing in this world could harm him. "You can call me Chris," he said. "I'll carry you, Easier that way. He hoisted Sibyl onto his back and reached for Sharon. The little girl shook her head and refused his offer. Chris didn't push it. He turned and walked toward the church's exit, sensing a living presence in that direction, likely Rose. The moment they stepped outside, Sibyl's perception of the world snapped into a hellish overlay. The sky was blood red, crimson flames licked the ground, and buildings melted into flesh and bone. It was a glimpse of the other world. But as soon as Sibyl registered that Chris was carrying her, the vision vanished, as if it had never been. She knew it wasn't mere imagination. Before meeting Chris, she had nearly died inside those illusions. She stared at him, part awe, part suspicion, and felt sure he was an angel sent by God. Chris himself had only felt a brief itch at the base of his skull, like something trying to burrow in. It lasted a heartbeat and then was gone. For a second, he half-joked to himself that perhaps he was finally growing a brain. Given the town's peculiarities, though, he suspected the sensation had been Alessa trying to pull him into the other world. With him present, nothing else manifested. The streets remained ordinary, and the danger that had haunted Sibyl's past vanished as if it had been a fever dream. They walked on. Then Sharon suddenly broke into a run, shouting, "Mom! Mom!" Chris frowned. He saw no one in front of them, but when he extended his spiritual sense, he registered a living presence a short distance away, Rose. Sharon had reached her spot and fell to her knees, sobbing as if her mother stood right beside her. In a way, she did. Rose was there, but in another dimension. They occupied parallel spaces, able to sense each other, but unable to touch. Rose, standing on a scorched, collapsing street, had also felt Sharon and cried out, "Sharon! Where are you? Mommy's right here." At this point, because of her reconciliation with Alessa, Rose was no longer tormented by the town's monsters. Alessa, who had been bound to Rose, had restrained the projections born of Rose's fear. Alessa herself appeared to Rose then, her voice threaded with confusion. "My power is ineffective around that man," she said. "I can't pull the people near him into my world, and I can't pull you out of here. Do you know who he is?" She projected an image of Chris into Rose's mind. Since Chris wasn't from this world, the likeness meant nothing to Rose. He was a stranger. Alessa's power grew out of the suffering she'd endured. It split reality into two overlapping layers of space. The outer layer she made was a haze-shrouded ruin. Everything there was decayed and dilapidated. That was also where her physical body lay, severely burned, in the deepest part of the hospital. The cultists and Alessa's birth mother were trapped there too, their minds tormented. The inner layer was a spiritual realm, a warped inner world Alessa could pull people into. Rose, after letting Alessa possess her, had been dragged into that inner world. It had nearly killed her and threatened Sharon and Sibyl more than once. When Chris first came into that place, he landed in the outer world. After he killed the cultists and left the church with Sibyl and Sharon, his powerful life force acted like an anchor. It kept Sharon and Sibyl from being held by Alessa's constructed space and pulled them back toward the real dimension. But Rose, already given over to Alessa, remained inside the inner world. Chris's presence suppressed some of Alessa's abilities. Alessa could not pull people into her realm while he stood nearby, and she could not send them through his barrier back into the real world. The result was a painful stalemate. Chris and Sharon, both spiritually sensitive, could sense Rose. Rose, possessed, could feel her daughter. They could not reach each other. Chris did not understand that his very presence neutralized parts of Alessa's power. He only knew Sharon wept in reality and Rose suffered in the inner world. Alessa's answer was cunning and simple. "Go to the hospital," she told Rose. "That's where my body rests. My influence on the real world is strongest there. I should be able to send messages." Rose hesitated, staring into the empty nothing she could feel but not see. Alessa promised that Sharon would sense her movement and follow. The resentment that had once burned Alessa pure had been dulled. Most of the sinners who'd hurt her were already dead, and she chose, for reasons that mixed malice and a strange tenderness, to try this. Rose stood and left. In the real dimension, Chris noticed Rose's departure and felt a flicker of curiosity about what she intended. Sharon, feeling her mother's pull, paused only a moment before following. Chris went after them, leaving Sibyl bewildered by the strange pair she trailed behind. They reached the abandoned hospital. The instant they crossed its threshold, the outer world flared up for a heartbeat. Siebel saw that hellish scene again. For a moment, Chris felt as if his mind, clouded before, cleared. He recovered a snap of sanity that lasted barely longer than the flash of the vision. Inside her inner realm, Alessa rebelled. This was where her body lay. Here, her power should be absolute. She slammed her will against Chris's anchor, pouring everything she had into the attack, trying to force him into illusion. She did not expect to pull him fully into her outer world, but she refused to believe she could not at least throw him into a vision on her home ground. Her exertion made the inner world collapse. Rose tumbled out of that spiritual space and reappeared in the outer world. But Sharon and the others were still in the real world, separated by the dimensional layer until Alessa focused enough force to reach them. Chris's eyes went strange. A haze crept across his vision, and the hospital around them decayed into rot. Once he was pulled into the illusion, neither Sibyl nor Sharon could resist. Both were dragged into the outer world Alessa had created. The reunion was immediate. "Mom!" Sharon ran, and Rose answered with fierce sobs, scooping her daughter up and clinging to her as if she would never let go. Near the window, a nurse wept with her back to them. On the bed lay the burned girl, Alessa, her ruined body a raw and terrible sight. Sibyl hovered, suspended as if held by a bubble of air, drawn to Alessa's main body. "Is this the girl from 30 years ago?" she wondered aloud, stunned. No one answered. Rose and Sharon were folding into each other. The nurse was silently mourning, and Sibyl felt herself inexplicably pulled closer. Chris had been planted with an illusion by Alessa. Though he had not physically entered the outer world, he could see its scenes as if they were real. The mother and daughter reunited, Alessa on the bed, the weeping nurse. Looking at Alessa, whether the vision was true or not, he felt a kind of triumphant pride radiating from the ruined body, as if that suffering form had won something great. He shook his head to clear the delusion and stepped closer, curious to see the nurse's face for himself. As he moved, Sibyl moved too, and then realized there was nothing under her. Chris, who had been carrying her, had gone. She cried out. The nurse flinched at Sibyl's scream and backed into the corner, trying to hide her scarred face. Chris set Sibyl down gently and went nearer to Alessa. Seeing the burned girl, remembering what she had endured, something in him moved. Compassion, pity, something almost tender. He produced a teacup. The moment the teacup appeared, the spell shattered. The inner world Alessa had constructed dissolved. Everything and everyone she had pulled in snapped back into the real world, including her own main body. Alessa stared in surprise as Chris stood over her, steady and calm. He pressed the teacup to her forehead and tipped it, letting the last drops of tea fall. Where the drop touched, a small miracle happened. The charred skin smoothed and healed. The broken threads of two souls, mother and daughter, seemed to stitch back together. The nurse's scarred face was restored. Rose and Sibyl's wounds eased. Even Alessa's biological mother, out beyond the church, felt the burden she'd borne lift and the old sins assuaged. A warm, almost reborn peace filled the room. Then Chris was gone. He slipped away as quietly and bewilderingly as he had acted, leaving behind people who would never forget. In their darkest hour, an angel had come and filled in what they had lost, an impossible kindness that left them healed and changed.